I always thought my life with Ethan was solid and unshakable. Nearly a decade of marriage had woven our lives so closely together that I couldn't imagine life without him. Through all the highs and lows, he had been my rock, the one steady hand I could reach for in any storm. He grounded me in ways I couldn't always put into words, and with Ethan by my side, I felt a sense of peace that I believed would last forever. Our life together had settled into something reliable, a rhythm so steady it almost felt choreographed. We had our routine: work, dinner, Netflix, and late-night talks under the warm glow of our bedroom lamp. We didn't need grand plans or constant excitement. Being together was enough. There was something so comforting about knowing exactly how the evening would unfold. Every night, after our shows, we'd slip into bed, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat as we talked about everything and nothing until one of us fell asleep. Ethan had this quiet, gentle way of making the ordinary feel special. He'd leave little notes on the fridge, just a simple thinking of you scribbled on a sticky note, or dinner's on me tonight, his handwriting a bit messy, always slightly tilted to the right. Those notes were small gestures, but they held a warmth that wrapped around me every time I saw them. And he had this way of paying attention to the tiniest details about my day, like remembering that I had a big meeting at 2 p.m. or that I'd mentioned wanting to try the new cafe down the street. He listened to me, truly listened, in a way that made me feel seen and valued. Ethan was the kind of partner who thought ahead, always leaving things better for me, whether it was filling the car with gas before I had to drive it or brewing the coffee just right on busy mornings. I never had to ask, he just did it. In every way that mattered, he was perfect for me. He was my safe place, my home, the person who made everything feel right. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. But there were times, late at night, when I'd lie awake beside him, the room bathed in the soft, bluish glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. The ceiling stretched above me, blank and quiet, mirroring the empty feeling that settled in my chest. I could hear Ethan's steady, gentle breathing beside me, a sound that used to be my comfort, but now, in those restless hours, it only deepened the hollow ache I tried to ignore. The spark that once crackled between us, that electric thrill that made my heart race, had softened over the years into something warm and steady, a quiet glow, more like embers than a flame. I tried to tell myself this was just the way love matured, that the feverish intensity of early passion was meant to mellow with time. I'd wrap myself in those thoughts like a familiar blanket, convincing myself that what we had was enough. Stability, I reminded myself, was something to be grateful for. Stability meant safety, reliability, all the things people long for. Routine didn't have to mean boredom, I'd say. Stability didn't have to mean we were stuck. But the words felt hollow, and the ache persisted, a gentle, nagging reminder that something was missing, a whisper of a life that felt a little brighter, a little fuller than the one I was living now. And so, I brushed those feelings aside, tucking them away in the quiet spaces of my mind, hoping they'd fade with the dawn. Then came that evening, the night everything changed. It was a work event, the kind of gathering where people wore polite smiles and held onto their glasses of sparkling wine a little too tightly. The air was thick with chatter, conversations drifting in and out about upcoming deadlines, recent promotions, and weekend plans. The lights were dim, casting a soft, golden glow over the room, and the hum of clinking glasses and low laughter filled the space. I was in the middle of nodding through a conversation about a project I'd grown tired of, my mind half wandering as I scanned the room. And then I saw him. Julian stood near the bar, tall and slightly slouched, his dark hair falling in casual waves that curled just at the ends. His suit fit him well, hugging his frame in a way that made him stand out from the usual crowd of my colleagues. There was something unpolished about him, a ruggedness that was captivating. His eyes, deep and sharp, held a glint of mischief that seemed to dance in the low light, as if he knew secrets about the world that the rest of us didn't. It was the glint that drew me in, a small spark that felt like it was directed at me alone. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, everything else faded. The voices, the clinking glasses, the room itself. He smiled, an easy, crooked smile that felt disarmingly natural, and I felt myself smiling back before I even realized it. I can't remember who approached whom, or even how we started talking. All I remember is his voice, a low, confident tone that seemed to resonate in my chest. He said something that made me laugh, and it wasn't just polite laughter. It was real, deep, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere hidden and forgotten. I hadn't laughed like that in so long, and it caught me off guard, leaving me feeling lighter than I had in ages. Julian's smile was magnetic, drawing me in with a warmth that felt both thrilling and unsettling. As he spoke, I found myself hanging on to his every word, noticing the way he'd lean in just slightly when he made a joke, his eyes watching mine to see my reaction. His gaze never wavered, making me feel like I was the only person in the room, like he was genuinely interested in me. Not just the polite, surface-level interest people show at these gatherings, but something deeper. There was a quiet confidence in the way he spoke, a steadiness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in so long. For a while, it was just conversation, a playful back and forth that left me both intrigued and nervous. I told myself it was just a harmless connection, a fleeting attraction that would pass by the end of the evening. But as the night wore on, I felt myself leaning into Julian's presence, drawn to the intensity and warmth that seemed to radiate from him. His laughter was contagious, his gaze unwavering, and with each minute that slipped by, I felt the boundaries of propriety blur. At some point, he asked for my number. My heart skipped a beat, a quiet thrill rushing through me as I handed him my phone, telling myself it was innocent, that we could be just friends. After all, he was just someone who made me laugh, someone who made me feel alive for a few hours. But when I woke up the next morning and saw a message from him lighting up my screen, my heart leapt in a way that I hadn't felt in years. There was something thrilling about being wanted by someone new, someone outside of the familiar world I had built with Ethan. It was like a spark had been lit inside me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the rush of excitement, the flutter of anticipation. Julian was different, someone unknown, someone who seemed to see parts of me that I hadn't let myself acknowledge in ages. And in that moment, I let myself indulge in that feeling, not realizing just how much it would cost me. At first, it was just texting, little things, like sharing silly memes or laughing about the mundane parts of our day. Julian would send me photos of his coffee cup with a half-hearted doodle on the napkin beside it, or make some witty remark about the slow, dragging hours at work. I would laugh, feeling a warmth in my chest that was strangely comforting. But over time, those simple exchanges grew. Our messages turned into long, late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours, words shared quietly under the blanket of night when the world outside felt distant and dreamlike. I would lie in bed, my room bathed in the soft glow from my phone, clinging to every word that popped up on the screen. Each time his name flashed, my heart fluttered. I'd hold my phone close, fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for his response, feeling a thrill with each vibration, each tiny moment of connection. It was as if my whole world had shrunk to the light of that screen and the words he sent across the distance between us. There was something utterly magnetic about Julian. He didn't tiptoe around words like most people did. His humor was sharp and daring, his compliments bolder than I was used to, and his stories vivid, full of color and life. He had this effortless confidence, the kind that seeped through even the briefest texts. His messages would start with a teasing remark or a question that would catch me off guard, pulling me in, making me want to respond with the same honesty, the same intensity. In his words, I felt alive, as if he was breathing life into a part of me I hadn't realized was fading. With Julian, I wasn't just the dependable wife or the responsible colleague. I was a woman who was desired, someone who was seen. It felt like he had awakened something that had been asleep for years, a spark that made my skin tingle and my heart race. He was more than just a distraction. He was a reminder of who I used to be before life settled into routines and predictability, a reminder of the woman who once dreamed, laughed freely, and felt deeply. And every night, as I lay there with the darkness wrapping around me and his words filling the silence, I found myself slipping further, drawn into the thrill and mystery of it all, wondering what it would be like to let go completely, even just for a moment. One Friday evening, we decided to meet. I found myself in a quiet, tucked-away cafe, a place where no one would recognize me, my heart pounding as I spotted him at a corner table. He looked up, smiled, and suddenly the room felt warmer, more intimate. We talked for hours, laughter spilling out between us like something precious, a secret shared. I felt lighter, like every word peeled back a layer I had buried long ago. At some point, he reached across the table to hold my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. A shiver ran through me. I knew I should pull back, but I couldn't. There was something intoxicating about the danger, the thrill of it all. At that moment, I was no longer the wife, the reliable partner, the one with a quiet, steady life. I was simply a woman, desired and wanted. That night, I made a choice that would change everything, igniting a brief but all-consuming affair. It was like stepping into a different world, a place where the rules of my usual life didn't exist, and everything felt intoxicatingly new. Our secret meetings quickly became the highlight of my week, a refuge from the familiar patterns of my day-to-day. Just the thought of seeing Julian sent a rush of energy through my veins, making my heart pound with anticipation. Each encounter with him left me breathless, his presence pulling me into a whirlwind of emotions I hadn't felt in years. We'd meet in tucked-away cafes, dimly lit lounges, and secluded spots around the city. Places I'd never been before, spots that seemed to belong to us alone. It felt as if we were the only two people in the world, like time itself slowed down just for us. I remember one small, candlelit bistro where the tables were close together, almost conspiratorial. We would sit in a cozy corner, leaning in close, our faces inches apart, sharing whispered secrets and stolen smiles as his finger performed magic inside of me. It was so good, and I felt free to let down the barriers I had built over the years. When we made love at his place or some hideaway hotel, his touch was electrifying, sending sparks along my skin. Even the smallest brush of his hand felt like a fire ignited just beneath the surface. He'd stroke me deeper, lingering just long enough to make me feel a thrilling tension that left me dizzy with anticipation. Every glance, every word he spoke seemed charged with a raw intensity. His voice was low, a quiet murmur that felt like it was meant only for me, and his words carried a daring charm that set my heart racing. I would hang on to each syllable, soaking up the warmth of his attention like sunlight after a long, cold winter. With Julian, I felt alive in a way I hadn't known was possible. It was as if he had unlocked a part of me that had been asleep, buried beneath the comfortable layers of my marriage and everyday life. In those moments, I was no longer a wife or a woman bound by routine. I was simply a woman, desired, wanted, and filled with a burning energy that made me feel young and vibrant again. I felt beautiful, seen, and understood in ways I hadn't allowed myself to be for so long. And yet, beneath the thrill, there was a faint whisper of something darker. I knew this couldn't last, that this world we'd created in hidden corners and secret places was fragile, temporary. But I pushed those thoughts away, clinging instead to the fleeting moments that made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. In Julian's presence, I could forget the rules, the responsibilities, and even the guilt that lingered somewhere deep inside me. I could lose myself in the fantasy, if only for a little while longer. But as the weeks wore on, that thrill began to fade, replaced by something heavier, darker. Each time I returned home, guilt wrapped around me like a tightening chain. Ethan would greet me with that gentle smile, pull me into his warm embrace, and ask about my day. His love was unwavering, his faith in me so pure that I felt like a fraud. How could I look into his trusting eyes, knowing the truth I kept hidden? The nights became torturous. I would lie awake beside Ethan, feeling the weight of my secret press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The excitement I had once felt with Julian now seemed hollow, empty. I realized that with Julian, I was chasing a spark, a fleeting thrill. But with Ethan, I had a home, a love that had been there all along, solid and true. Finally, I knew what I had to do. The decision hadn't come easily. It felt like peeling back layers of my own skin, but deep down, I understood that my life with Ethan was slipping through my fingers. The guilt had woven itself into my everyday moments, turning smiles into masks and leaving me feeling hollow inside. That night, after hours of pacing, I made up my mind. I met Julian at a small cafe on the edge of town, the same one where we'd spent countless evenings hidden away from the world. The familiar scent of coffee and the soft, ambient music playing in the background felt comforting. But tonight, they carried a bittersweet edge. Julian was already there, sitting by the window, his figure bathed in the golden glow of the overhead light. He looked up as I approached, his usual warm smile briefly softening the ache in my chest. For a moment, I hesitated, my feet rooted to the floor, but I forced myself to sit across from him, determined to see this through. The nights became torturous. I would lie awake beside Ethan, feeling the weight of my secret press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The excitement I had once felt with Julian now seemed hollow, empty. I realized that with Julian, I was chasing a spark, a fleeting thrill. But with Ethan, I had a home, a love that had been there all along, solid and true. Finally, I knew what I had to do. The decision hadn't come easily. It felt like peeling back layers of my own skin, but deep down, I understood that my life with Ethan was slipping through my fingers. The guilt had woven itself into my everyday moments, turning smiles into masks and leaving me feeling hollow inside. That night, after hours of pacing, I made up my mind. I met Julian at a small cafe on the edge of town, the same one where we'd spent countless evenings hidden away from the world. The familiar scent of coffee and the soft, ambient music playing in the background felt comforting. But tonight, they carried a bittersweet edge. Julian was already there, sitting by the window, his figure bathed in the golden glow of the overhead light. He looked up as I approached, his usual warm smile briefly softening the ache in my chest. For a moment, I hesitated, my feet rooted to the floor, but I forced myself to sit across from him, determined to see this through. Julian's dark eyes studied me with that familiar, intense gaze that had once drawn me in so deeply. He was silent, sensing something different in my expression. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling slightly as I placed them on the table. The words sat heavily on my tongue, each one a weight pressing down on my heart. "Julian," I began, barely recognizing my own voice, "we can't keep doing this. I have to stop. I have to go back to my life." He listened, his face steady, his gaze fixed on mine, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a flash of hurt, maybe, or understanding. He nodded, but it was a slow, reluctant movement, like he was forcing himself to accept something he didn't want to believe. His face, usually so open and expressive, became unreadable, his eyes veiled with a sadness that he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide. As I pushed back my chair and stood to leave, Julian reached out, his hand hovering just inches from mine as though wanting to hold on but knowing he couldn't. He finally spoke, his voice a murmur, his words gentle yet charged with something I couldn't quite decipher. "I don't want you to end this." The softness of his words wrapped around me, stopping me in my tracks. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the bustling sounds of the cafe fading into a distant hum. I looked down, unable to meet his eyes, feeling the ache of his words settles deep within me. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn back, to forget everything I'd decided, to give into the comfort and excitement he offered. But I knew that was a path leading nowhere. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my legs to carry me out the door. I felt his gaze on my back, heavy and full of longing. As I walked away, my footsteps echoing on the pavement outside. The cool night air bit at my skin, but the warmth of his words lingered, haunting me. They echoed in my mind long after I left, following me like a shadow, a quiet whisper I couldn't shake. "I don't want you to end this." When I got home that night, I felt a chill run through me as I stepped into the quiet of our living room. It was dimly lit, only a single lamp casting a soft glow that barely reached the edges of the room. Ethan was there, sitting on the edge of the couch, his shoulders slumped forward. Shadows danced across his face, but even in that half-light, I could see the sadness in his eyes, so raw, so deep, it felt like it could swallow me whole. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at me, a silent question lingering in his gaze. There was a heaviness in his eyes, an understanding that I couldn't fathom. Somehow, he saw right through me, saw the cracks in my heart that I tried so desperately to hide. I didn't know how he knew, but it was as if my guilt had seeped into the room, palpable and undeniable. My resolve crumbled in that moment. The weight of everything, the secrets, the lies, the betrayal, pressed down on me, and I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I felt my knees go weak as I sank into a chair, my face buried in my hands. The words tumbled out in broken sobs, spilling every detail, every painful truth that I had held back. I didn't spare myself or sugarcoat the reality. I let it all pour out, raw and jagged, each word like a blade I could feel cutting into both of us. I was afraid to look up, afraid to see the devastation on his face. But Ethan sat there, listening, absorbing every word, his face a mask of quiet, almost unbearable pain. His hands were clenched tightly in his lap, and I noticed the faint tremble in his fingers, a silent testament to the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. When I finally finished, the room felt hollow, the air heavy with all that had been said. Ethan looked at me, his voice so soft it was barely audible. I just want to know why. His words weren't accusing or angry. They were filled with deep, vulnerable hurt, a plea for some kind of understanding. And yet, I didn't have any answer that could make sense of the mess I'd made. There was no valid reason, no excuse. At that moment, I realized that my search for excitement, my need to feel something different, had nearly destroyed the only true love I had ever known. The thrill I had chased was nothing compared to the warmth and depth of the love I'd put at risk. Ethan sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned to me with a weary sigh, his eyes still wet with unshed tears. He gave me a choice, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. We could try to rebuild what I had broken, slowly and painfully, with open hearts and a willingness to confront the wounds I had caused. Or, he said, I could leave, go find whatever happiness I thought was waiting out there. The decision would be mine, and he would honor it, no matter how much it hurt him. In that moment, overwhelmed with remorse, I realized there was no question in my heart. I chose to stay. I chose Ethan. I chose us. The path ahead looked uncertain, filled with painful conversations and shattered trust that would take time to mend. But I knew that whatever work lay ahead, I was willing to do it, to fight for the love I had almost lost. Ethan was still here, offering me a lifeline, a chance to make things right, and I held onto it with everything I had.